The ham was honey glazed. I remember that specifically because I was focusing very hard on it when my mother said the thing she's been saying for 30 years, and I needed something to look at that wasn't her face. "You were always the difficult one," she said, just like that. Casual as weather, casual as passing the green beans, which she also did, simultaneously, one hand handing off a ceramic bowl of someone else's labor, while the other hand handed off 30 years of mine. Patricia Whitfield, 64 years old, wearing the coral cardigan she'd owned since the early 2000s, sitting at the head of the Easter table in the house I secretly own, calling me difficult, in front of my brother, my sister, my brother's wife, my sister's boyfriend du jour, and approximately 4,000 calories of carbohydrates none of us needed. I set my fork down. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I had 23 properties, 14 active tenants, and one very specific lease agreement sitting in my briefcase in the car parked in the driveway of the house described in that very specific lease agreement. But the ham was good, so I waited. This is the story of how I waited for 38 years and what happened when I finally stopped. Let me explain the seating arrangement, because seating arrangements at a Whitfield family dinner are not arbitrary. They are a form of communication, a status document rendered in chair placement and proximity to the breadbasket. Sean sits to my mother's right. He has sat to my mother's right at every family dinner since approximately 1994. He is 41 years old, an attorney specializing in estate law, and he has the kind of jaw that makes other people feel personally inadequate. He gets the first slice of everything: turkey, cake, attention, benefit of the doubt. My mother laughs loudest at his jokes even when they aren't funny. She asks about his cases with the rapt attention of someone who believes she is personally implicated in the success of every legal brief he has ever written. Maisie sits to my mother's left. She is 33 and still somehow the baby, a trick of family mythology that has survived a decade of adult behavior on Maisie's part, including but not limited to borrowing $1,400 in 2019 for a pottery class that never resulted in pottery, losing a lease twice in 3 years, and once calling me from a gas station in Terre Haute at 11:30 at night because she'd forgotten her PIN and needed me to Venmo her $40 for gas, which I did, and which she described to my mother the following week as "Dara bailed me out again," a framing I have spent 6 years trying to understand the injustice of. Maisie didn't return the $40. Maisie has never returned anything. She calls this family. I sit across from Sean. This is geometrically neutral and emotionally precise, equidistant from both children my mother actually worries about, close enough to be included in the census of the gathering, far enough to be safely ignored. I've sat in this chair, or its equivalent, my entire life. The boyfriend du jour, Derek, I think, or maybe Derek with an A. Maisie goes through them with the same energy she applies to gym memberships, sits next to her with the slightly hunted look of a man who has just realized this family is more complicated than the one introductory conversation about favorite movies suggested. I felt for him. Not enough to warn him, but I felt for him. Sean's wife, Candace, was there, which is relevant later. Candace is a woman who has the unique ability to be present in a room without contributing anything to it. Not out of shyness, but out of a kind of practiced social efficiency. She has decided exactly which Whitfield family dynamics are worth engaging with, and she engages with 0 of them. I respect this more than I've ever told her. So, Easter dinner, the ham, the green beans, the asparagus my mother does in foil with olive oil and garlic because she saw it on a cooking show in 2018, and it has now entered permanent rotation, which is one of the things I love about her, actually. One of the specific things, and that's important to say now because the story gets complicated, and I want you to understand from the beginning that I love her. I just love her the way you love weather, without expectation of reciprocity. You were always the difficult one. What had I done to earn it this time? Good question. I'd been sitting there for 2 hours. I'd helped carry the food from the kitchen. I'd asked about Sean's case and Maisie's new job and my mother's book club. I'd answered every question directed at me, both of them. And I'd kept my voice even and my face pleasant and my wine glass below the refill line that signals to your family that you're coping. What I had done, apparently, was offer a differing opinion on the topic of whether my mother should renew her lease. I just think, I had said, cutting my ham with the precision of someone who has been managing her physical responses for 30 years, that you shouldn't make any decisions until you've had time to review the terms. Sean had said he was looking into alternatives, something better, something closer to his house in Carmel. I had said, mildly, calmly, with every muscle in my face performing equanimity, that moving was a significant decision and there was no rush. And my mother had looked at me across the green beans and the asparagus and the honey-glazed ham, and she had said it. You were always the difficult one. And then she'd asked Maisie if she wanted more bread. The table moved on. This is the other thing about being the difficult one. When you're designated as difficult, anything you say becomes evidence of the difficulty, and the family's ability to move past your moments of difficulty is frictionless because they've had decades of practice. Sean caught my eye across the table and did the thing he does. The microscopic shrug that means you know how she is. Don't make it a thing. Which is the shrug of a man who has never been told he was difficult in his life and genuinely cannot fathom why it might land differently at 38 than it did at 8. I looked at my plate. The briefcase was in the car. The ham was good. I waited. You want to know how a person becomes a landlord. You want the origin story. Fair enough? I'll give it to you, but I'm going to need to back up far enough that you understand what I was working with. I was born in the middle. This is the least remarkable thing about me, but it is the most organizing thing about me, in the way that the structural middle of a bridge is unremarkable until it gives way. Sean came first, which in a family like ours was not just a birth order, but an inheritance. He was born with the expectations attached, and grew into them the way a vine grows into a trellis, effortlessly, and taking its shape. 6 years later came Maisie, the punctuation mark, the surprise that became the favorite kind of surprise. Small, sweet, and requiring of everything. I came in the middle, 11 months after Sean, which made me Irish twins with my brother in the technical sense, and also invisible in every practical sense, because an Irish twin to a golden child is not a twin. It is a shadow with different birthday candles. I was not a sick child, which meant I did not get the particular attention that comes with illness. Maisie had asthma through her childhood, a fact around which significant amounts of the family's emotional energy organized itself. I was not academically spectacular in the way that earned special conversations at dinner about my potential. Sean tested into the gifted program, a fact my mother mentioned at enough social occasions that I eventually calculated she had referenced it to approximately 140 separate people over a 20-year period. I was smart, but I was not gifted program smart, which in our family was the distinction between real smart and just fine smart. And I was not compliant, which was the real problem, the real, organizing, central problem that everything else arranged itself around. I wasn't difficult in any meaningful sense. I want to be honest about this because I'm not going to dress up the story into something it wasn't. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't destructive. I wasn't a disciplinary catastrophe. I just asked questions. I asked questions about the rules when the rules seemed arbitrary. I said when I disagreed. I noticed things out loud that the family preferred noticed silently. I said, once, at age 12, that it wasn't fair that Sean had a later curfew than I did when I was a full 11 months younger than him, and had never given anyone a reason to be concerned. And my mother had looked at me with this particular expression she had. Not angry, not dismissive, something more like puzzled, and said, "Dara, why do you always have to make things complicated?" I was 12. I spent the next 26 years answering that question in the privacy of my own head. Here's the thing about being called difficult so many times that it becomes your name within a family. At some point, you have a choice. You can fight it, which is exhausting and mostly ineffective, or you can take the word and do something with it. I took the word. I was difficult. Fine. I would be difficult in ways that mattered. I left Indianapolis at 18 for state school, came back at 24 with a degree in business management, and a head full of ideas and a credit score I'd maintained with religious devotion, because I'd read somewhere at 19 that a credit score was a kind of freedom, and I had decided, at 19, to collect every kind of freedom I could get my hands on. I took a job at a property management company on the Northeast Side. I was good at it the way I was good at most things that required attention and precision, and the ability to hold a lot of moving pieces in your head simultaneously, which I now understand is a skill, and which my family had always interpreted as me being complicated about everything. I saved. I invested. I reinvested. I bought my first property at 27, a duplex off Keystone that needed more work than the inspection had suggested, which is how I met Hector Miranda. Hector showed up to repair the kitchen, looked at what I'd described to him and what I'd described to him, and what the actual kitchen looked like, and said, with the directness that I would come to understand was his primary personality trait, "Whoever sold you this property lied to you or didn't know. Either way, this is a bad kitchen. What do you want to do?" I said, "Fix it." He said, "That's going to be expensive." I said, "I know. How expensive?" He told me. I didn't blink. He later told me that was the moment he decided I was worth working with. He'd met a lot of first-time landlords, and most of them blinked. I didn't blink because I couldn't afford to blink. If I blinked, I'd accepted that I'd made a mistake. And if I'd made a mistake, I had to go back to my family at Sunday dinner and admit that Dara, yes, the difficult one, the one who always thinks she knows better, had made a mistake, and I would not do that. I would fix the kitchen and rent the duplex, and I would not blink. I fixed the kitchen, rented the duplex, did not blink. Hector became my contractor. 4 years later, my business partner. By the time I was 31, we had 6 properties under the LLC he and I ran together, Whitfield Miranda Properties, though the name on the lease agreements was a single corporate entity, because I'd read enough about business by then to know that anonymity was a feature, not a bug. 23 properties by 38. It's not empires. It's not a documentary about me on a financial network. It's just 12 years of getting up early and paying attention and being, yes, difficult, in the specific sense of not stopping when things got hard. Now I need to tell you about the house. My mother has lived in the same suburb since 1989. She raised 3 children in a house on Fieldcrest Drive that my father, who is a separate story entirely, a story of chronic absence dressed in the costume of presence, eventually moved out of in 2003, when I was 16 and Sean was 17, and Maisie was 11, and the marriage had long since become a household custom more than a choice. The Fieldcrest house was sold in 2012, during the divorce, and my mother moved into a rental, a 3-bedroom colonial on Maplecrest Court, owned at the time by a guy named Dennis Holloway, who managed his 3 properties out of a shoebox and considered himself a businessman in the way people consider themselves musicians because they have a guitar in the corner of the bedroom. She'd been in that house for 5 years when Dennis Holloway called me. He didn't call me because he knew I was Patricia Whitfield's daughter. He called me because Hector and I had been expanding our footprint in that part of the suburbs, and we'd sent out letters, professional, low-key, the kind of letter that lets an overextended landlord know someone is paying attention. And Dennis called because he was tired, and his wife wanted a condo in Florida, and he had 3 properties he needed to move. I didn't realize until I pulled up the address spreadsheet what one of the 3 addresses was. I sat in my office for a long time, looking at Maplecrest Court. I want to be careful here about what I tell you my motivation was, because I've told myself several different versions of this story over 7 years, and I know now which version is true, even if it's the least flattering one. The true version is this. My first thought was not revenge. My first thought, my actual, unmediated 31-year-old first thought, was she could lose her home. Dennis Holloway was selling. If he sold to someone else, some developer, some out-of-state LLC that didn't care about anything except rent ratios. My mother, at 57, recently divorced, on a fixed income with 2 of her 3 children occasionally borrowing from her rather than the other way around. My mother could lose the home she'd built her rebuilt life in. My second thought was that she'd never ask me for help. Not out of pride. Not even. Just genuinely. It wouldn't occur to her. Sean was the one she'd call. Sean was the attorney. The capable one. The one who handled things. I was the difficult one. The one who asked too many questions. She wouldn't call me. So I didn't wait to be called. I bought the house. I bought it through the LLC. I reduced her rent $200 below the market rate for comparable properties in that zip code. I had the LLC's management company send the new lease agreement with a standard form letter. And my mother signed it, and she's been signing it every 2 years since, and she has never once asked who she was renting from. I want you to hear that. She has never asked. I'm not sure what that says about her faith in the stability of her situation. I'm not sure what it says about how little curiosity she has about the structures around her life. I know what Hector says it says, and I'll get to that. I sat at the closing table alone, and I signed my name on 22 pages, and I drove home, and I didn't tell anyone. Not Hector, initially. Not my therapist, who I was seeing at the time and who I told many things. Nobody. I just paid, and kept the lights on and went home. This is the part of the story where I tell you it wasn't revenge. It was love. And it was love. I mean that without irony or asterisk. But love and protection have this uncomfortable overlap with control, and I have spent 7 years examining where one ends and the others begin in this particular situation, and I haven't fully resolved it. And I'm telling you that up front because I'm not going to let this story be simpler than it actually is. Hector found out 2 years in, the way Hector finds out about everything I try to keep from him, which is to say, by asking a direct question I wasn't ready for. We were going over the portfolio, quarterly review, the office on Delaware Street where we keep the whiteboards and the spreadsheets and a coffee maker that Hector has had opinions about for 3 years, but hasn't replaced. He pulled up the Maplecrest property, looked at the rent figure, looked at comparable properties, looked at me. This one's underperforming, he said. I know. Is there a reason? Yes. Pause. Are you going to tell me the reason? I told him. He sat with it for longer than most people would sit with a thing. Hector processes information the way a good contractor assesses a damaged structure. He walks around it. He looks at it from different angles. He doesn't say anything until he knows what he's actually looking at. Then he said, "She doesn't know." "No." "And she calls you difficult." "Yes." He picked up his coffee. He set it down. He said, "Dara, you've been subsidizing a woman who calls you difficult. That's not generosity. That's a hostage situation." I said, "I'm not a hostage." He said, "I know. I'm saying she is. And she doesn't know it. And you're the one holding the key, and you haven't decided yet what you're going to do with it." I thought about that for a long time. I thought about it on the drive home. I thought about it in the shower. I thought about it at 3 in the morning when my brain does the thing it does, which is review every decision I've ever made with the critical thoroughness of a very hostile auditor. Was Hector right? Was I holding a key? The answer I kept arriving at was yes. But the lock was on a door I hadn't opened. I hadn't told her. I hadn't threatened her. I hadn't done anything with the knowledge except protect her from it. Protect her from knowing that her most difficult child was the one who'd made sure she didn't have to move. But Hector's point was sitting there, patient as concrete. I had the key. I just hadn't decided yet what the key was for. Easter dinner. Back to Easter dinner, because we've left it long enough. Dessert was a carrot cake from a bakery rather than homemade, which my mother mentioned twice, not because she was criticizing Candace, who had brought it, but because she was performing a kind of nostalgia for homemade things that she felt made her sound like the kind of mother who had made homemade things, which she had, sometimes, when the mood struck her. But the implication was broader than the evidence supported. Sean was in a good mood, which, with Sean, means he has something he wants to announce. I can read Sean's moods the way I can read a property inspection report. I know which damage is cosmetic and which damage is structural, and I know when someone is performing confidence because they have news. He waited until the cake was mostly served. Then he did the thing he does, where he leans back in his chair a little and touches his collar in a gesture that's supposed to read as casual and actually reads as a man preparing to receive acknowledgement. "I wanted to mention," he said, "that I've been doing some thinking about Mom's situation." My mother looked at him the way she's been looking at him since 1984, like he'd just announced the discovery of something important. "I've been reviewing her finances," Sean continued, "and I think there's a better option for her than the current rental." I looked at my plate, kept my face at equanimity. "There's a new development in Carmel," he said. "Nice condo complex, good amenities, closer to us. I've been in touch with the management, and I think we can get her into a unit that's significantly nicer than what she's in now." My mother made the sound she makes when she's pleased. A soft, comprehensive exhale that communicates she feels taken care of, which is the thing she prizes above almost everything else. Maisie said, "Oh, that sounds amazing, Mom." Derek said nothing, because he was wisely maintaining his policy of non-engagement. Candace was looking at the table. I looked at Sean. I said, mildly, carefully, with the precision of someone who has been managing her physical responses for 30 years. "Which complex?" He named it. "I know every major residential property development in the Indianapolis suburban market. I've been tracking them for 12 years. I track them the way other people track their fantasy football teams, which is to say obsessively and with spreadsheets. I knew the complex he named. I knew it specifically because 18 months ago, when it was in development, Hector and I had looked at investing in it and decided the numbers didn't work for what they were charging. I knew what the units went for. I knew the HOA structure. I also knew, because I make it my business to know these things, that the developer had done a pre-sale investor round, and one of the investors, a small stake, nothing dramatic, the kind of stake an estate attorney might pick up as a tax strategy, was listed under a holding company I recognized from court filings I'd reviewed during a separate due diligence process. Sean's holding company. Sean was going to move our mother into a condo development he had a financial stake in. He was going to charge her market rate, which was $400 a month above what she was currently paying, while taking a tax deduction on his investment returns. He was not helping our mother. He was monetizing her. I looked at the carrot cake. I looked at the table. I looked at my hands in my lap. I said, "That sounds like something worth thinking about carefully." And my mother said, "I think it's wonderful that Sean is looking out for me." And I said very quietly, "Yes." And I left it there, because the ham was gone, but the briefcase was still in the car, and I had been the difficult one for 30 years, and I had learned something, slowly, painfully, the way you learn things that matter, that the best time to say the important thing is not always the first moment you can say it. I texted Hector from the driveway. "Need to talk tomorrow." Sean's plan is what I thought it might be. He responded in 4 seconds. He was watching a game. He always responds in 4 seconds because he keeps his phone face up. How bad? Financial conflict of interest. He has skin in the condo development. He's going to charge her $400 more a month while personally profiting. 3 dots. Then, "And you're going to let him?" I sat in the driveway for a moment. My mother's porch light was on. She always leaves it on when people are over. One of those small courtesies she genuinely offers without thinking. And it occurred to me, not for the first time, that she is not a bad person. She loves her children. She loves Sean the most fluidly, Maisie the most protectively, and me the most distantly, like something she can't quite get into focus. I'm not even sure she knows. I texted Hector back. "I need to see the Maple Crest lease file. The full file. Make me copies of everything." He sent back a thumbs up. I drove home in the dark through the Indianapolis suburbs, past the shopping centers and the Walgreens and the subdivisions that all look slightly like each other, past 23 properties I could identify by address, and I thought about keys and locks and what you decide to do with them. Hector had the file on my desk Monday morning. Lease agreement, original and renewal copies. 4 of them. The most recent signed 8 months ago. Payment history. Clean as a whistle. My mother has never missed a month. Not once in 7 years. Which is something I hold on to when I'm trying to maintain my complicated relationship with her. She is responsible. She keeps her commitments. She paid every month she called me difficult, and every month she didn't call me anything at all. Below the lease file, Hector had placed a second folder. I hadn't asked for it. I opened it. It was his analysis of Sean's proposed condo arrangement. He'd pulled the investor records, public filing, you can look them up if you know how, and done the math on what Sean stood to gain from my mother as a tenant versus what my mother would pay above her current rate over a projected 5-year residence. I looked at the number on the bottom of the page. I looked at it for a while. Hector appeared in the doorway with 2 coffees. He handed me one and sat down across from me in the client chair, which he does whenever we're going to have a real conversation rather than a business conversation, though with us, those are rarely separate categories. "You okay?" he said. "I'm fine." "You've been staring at that folder for 4 minutes. I was thinking." "About the mother?" "About all of it." He nodded. He let the silence sit, which is one of Hector's better qualities. I said, "Sean's not going to see it as exploitation. He genuinely thinks he's helping her. That's the thing. He thinks he found her a nice place to live and it happens to be one he has an interest in. And that's just smart planning. He probably hasn't even consciously run the conflict of interest analysis. It just doesn't occur to him." "Does it matter?" Hector said. "Whether he thought about it?" "No," I said. "The outcome's the same." "So what are you going to do?" I closed the folder. I looked at the lease. I thought about 38 years of setting forks down and waiting. I thought about my mother's porch light, on for guests who didn't always deserve the courtesy. I thought about the closing table 7 years ago, signing a loan, believing I was doing something good. I said, I'm going to call Sean and ask him to set up a family meeting. Tell him I have some thoughts about the condo proposal I'd like to share. Hector raised his eyebrows. And then? And then I'm going to share them. He drank his coffee. All of them? All of them. He nodded slowly. You want me there? No, I said. I want the folder, and the lease, and the LLC registration documents. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, 7 years. Yeah. She never asked. No. And you never told her? No. You know what that is, right? 7 years of paying and protecting and not telling her. You know what that is. I said, love. He said very gently, with the directness that I have come to understand is not unkindness, but its opposite. I was going to say grief, but yeah. Okay. Love too. Sean set up the meeting for a Saturday in May. His idea. A presentation. Because Sean cannot communicate anything of significance without a visual aid. He'd actually prepared slides. I know because he mentioned it casually in the group text where he announced the meeting. One of those casual mentions that's designed to communicate thoroughness and competence. I've put together some materials that I think lay everything out clearly. The meeting was at my mother's house, the house on Maple Crest Court. My house, technically, my LLC's house. With its kitchen I'd had repiped 4 years ago, and its roof I'd had replaced 2 years before that. 700 square feet of updates my mother had never had to negotiate for or worry about, because I handled them quietly, the way I handle most things. We all sat in the living room. Maisie was on the couch next to my mother. Sean stood near the television because he'd brought a laptop and a small wireless presentation clicker, which, I want you to understand, I say this without exaggerating, he had actually brought a wireless presentation clicker to a family meeting in his mother's rented living room. I sat in the armchair near the window. I had my folder on my lap. I had not told anyone what was in the folder. Sean ran through his slides. The condo complex was called the Meridian at Carmel. He showed photos, genuinely nice photos, bright kitchens, a pool, a walking trail. He showed a comparison of square footage. He showed amenities. He talked about proximity to his house, to Maisie's apartment, to the good hospital in Carmel that was marginally better than the one near my mother's current address. He had a slide called Why Now? That talked about my mother's stage of life and the value of being near family. He did not mention that he had a financial stake in the development. He did not mention what the condo would actually cost. He said the rent was competitive with market rate in the area, which is the way you say more expensive, when you don't want to say more expensive. My mother was nodding throughout. Maisie was nodding. Sean was warm and capable and organized, which is to say he was himself in the register he reserves for moments when he wants something. And what he wanted was for everyone to agree that this was a good idea, and for the meeting to be over in 45 minutes. He reached the last slide, which was titled Next Steps, and it had a bullet point that said, Secure Patricia's agreement to transition by June 1st. He said, So, questions? Thoughts? My mother looked at Maisie. Maisie looked at my mother. The look they exchanged was the look of people who have already discussed this privately and are now performing the public version of a decision they've made. I said, I have some questions. Sean turned toward me with the expression he has when I say I have questions, which is a kind of preemptive, patient fatigue, like a man preparing to explain something he's already explained. Sure, he said. I said, What's the monthly rate at the Meridian? He named a figure. I said, That's $412 a month more than you're currently paying, Mom. My mother said, Well, but it's nicer. I said, I'm not disagreeing that it's nicer. I'm noting the cost. Sean said, Dara, I said, I also want to note that over 5 years that's an additional $24,720 out of Mom's pocket. I opened my folder. I had time this week to pull the public investor records on the Meridian development. I looked at Sean. You have a stake in it. Silence. Not the casual family table silence, a different kind. Maisie said, What? Sean said, with the smoothness of a man who has spent his career arguing. I have a minor investment position that has no bearing on. A minor investment position, I said, that generates returns correlated to occupancy rates in the complex, which means that every month Mom writes a check $400 higher than she needs to. Some portion of that goes toward your returns. That is an enormous oversimplification. I can do the full calculation if you'd like, I said. I brought the documentation. Sean looked at my folder. He looked at me. He did the attorney thing, where he quickly reassesses what he knows about the situation. Dara, I also want to talk about the current rental, I said. My mother said, What about it? I said, Mom, who owns this house? She blinked. It's managed by a company. I just send the check to an LLC, I said. Do you know which LLC? She shook her head. The look on her face was a kind of bewilderment that I recognized. It's the look she gets when something is happening that she doesn't have a category for. I took the lease from the folder. I took the LLC registration document from the folder. I set them on the coffee table between us, next to a ceramic bowl I'd seen in this living room for 7 years, next to a lamp she'd had since the Fieldcrest house, next to the coaster set Maisie had given her 2 Christmases ago. I said, Whitfield Miranda Properties, LLC. That's mine, Mom. I bought this house 7 years ago when Dennis Holloway was going to sell it. I was worried you'd be displaced. I've been charging you $200 below market rate every month since. The room was very quiet. Sean was looking at the documents. Maisie had her mouth open. My mother was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 38 years. I didn't know, exactly, what the expression was. I'm still not entirely sure. It was something between recognition and confusion, and underneath both of those things, something that might have been, I'm not going to call it guilt, because I don't want to name it wrong, something that might have been the first moment in a long time that she was actually seeing me. She started. I own the house you live in, I said, keeping my voice level, keeping every muscle in my face at equanimity, because I had decided at 14 that I would not cry in front of my family, and I am 38 years old, and I have kept that decision through the kind of discipline that other people apply to diets or marathons. I have owned it for 7 years. I have maintained it, repaired it, kept the rent below what you should have been paying, and I never told you because I wasn't doing it to be thanked. I was doing it because you were my mother and I didn't want you to lose your home. Sean said, Dara. I'm not finished, I said. He stopped. Sean's proposal, I said, would cost Mom $1,400 more per month than her current arrangement, not $400 more than market rate, $1,400 more than what she pays me. I've done the full comparison and it's in here, and anyone who wants to look at it can look at it. I placed the final document on the coffee table. I'm not moving her into a development you have a financial stake in, Sean. Not because I'm being difficult, because the math doesn't work for her. And you either know that and don't care, or you haven't looked, and I'd be grateful to know which one it is. The silence after that was a different kind again. It was the silence of a room full of people who have just had the floor beneath them shift slightly, the way a building settles. Not catastrophically, but enough that everyone notices the walls aren't quite where they were. Sean's jaw did something complicated. He is a man who is very rarely in a position he didn't construct, and he was in one now. And I will tell you, not with satisfaction but with honesty, that there was something quietly momentous about watching him search for the words. "I wasn't trying to," he started. "I know," I said, and I meant it. "I don't think you were trying to exploit her. I think you weren't thinking about it hard enough because you've never had to think about it hard enough. That's not a crime. But it's not what Mom needs." Maisie said very quietly, "Dara, you own this house?" "Yes." "For 7 years?" "Yes." "And you never said anything?" I looked at my sister, who is sweet in the specific way of someone who has always been caught by the net of other people's effort, who has always floated through just above the ground because hands she never thought about kept her there. I looked at her, and I didn't feel anger, just a kind of tired tenderness. "No," I said. "I never said anything." My mother hadn't spoken since I'd placed the documents on the table. She was looking at the lease agreement, then at the LLC document, then back at the lease. Her fingers were near the edge of the paper, but not touching it. The way you hold your hands near something you aren't sure you're allowed to touch. She said, finally, quietly, "Dara." I said, "Yeah. Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about this. I had thought about it for 7 years. I had thought about it from every angle Hector had identified, and several he hadn't, and I had arrived at an answer that was true. "Because you would have either refused it," I said, "or taken it for granted. And I didn't want either of those things. I just wanted you to have a home." She looked at me for a long time. The particular look. The one I couldn't categorize. Then she did something that surprised me, which is rare, because I've spent 38 years studying this woman's behavior, with the focus of someone who has needed to in order to survive in close proximity to her. She looked down at her hands, and she didn't say anything at all, which was new, which was, from Patricia Whitfield, possibly the loudest thing she'd ever said. The meeting broke up without a conclusion, which was fine. Conclusions were not the point of the meeting. The point of the meeting was the floor shift, the wall recalibration, the moment where the story the family had been telling about who was reliable and who was difficult and who handled things underwent a structural review it had needed for a long time. Sean left with the smoothness of a man filing an appeal. He said he'd need to look at everything, that his intention had been good, that he thought we should all take time to think about what was best for Mom, which was true, and which was also the retreat of a man who knows he's lost the argument. Maisie hugged me in the driveway, which I wasn't expecting, and said, "I didn't know." And I said, "I know, Maze." And she said, "I should have known." And I said, "Yeah, probably." And she laughed a little, startled, because I'm not supposed to agree. But I was tired of performing the more comforting version of the truth. I sat in my car for a while before driving away. My mother hadn't said much after the initial exchange. She'd listened to Sean's retreat and Maisie's various small contributions, and she'd held her hands in her lap, and she'd looked at me intermittently with the expression I couldn't categorize, and she hadn't said the thing, hadn't called me difficult, hadn't performed the familiar reassignment of difficulty that makes the situation manageable for her. She'd just looked at me. I had 38 years of experience reading my mother's silences, and I could not read this one. And I am not going to tell you whether that means something changed, or whether it means I had finally hit the limit of what I can interpret. Both are possible. I've learned not to assign certainty to things that don't have it. I drove back through the suburbs, past the shopping centers, past the subdivisions, past the properties I could name by address. I went to my office on Delaware Street. It was a Saturday, so Hector wasn't there, but I have a key, obviously. And I sat at my desk, and I looked at the city of Indianapolis doing its Saturday afternoon thing through the window, and I thought about what Hector had said. Not generosity, a hostage situation, grief. But yeah, okay, love too. I thought about the expression on my mother's face, the one I couldn't read, the one that was new. I thought about 30 years of difficult, of setting forks down and waiting, of building something solid in the silence of someone else's disregard, and calling it protection, and maybe also, I'll say it now, in the privacy of this story, maybe also calling it proof. Look what I built. Look what the difficult one built, quietly, without anyone watching. Look what happens when you stop waiting to be seen and just start building. I thought about whether the proof had been for her or for me. Probably both. The honest answer is always, probably both. My mother called me on a Thursday, 5 weeks after the family meeting. I was in the office. Hector was doing something with a clipboard in the corner that involved more muttering than clipboards usually require. The spring afternoon was coming through the window at a low angle, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's about to mean something. The call came from her cell phone, which she only uses when she's making a deliberate call rather than a habitual one. She has a landline she uses for habit. The cell phone is for intention. I answered on the second ring. Hi, Mom. Hi, honey. She uses honey sometimes. Not always. Not patterned in any way I've ever been able to predict. I just had a quick question. Okay. About the rent. Okay. The lease renews in August. A pause. I could hear her in the kitchen. She always calls from the kitchen. The landline is in the kitchen. Old habit extended to the cell. I just wanted to know if anything is going to change. With the rent. I said, It's not going up, Mom. A breath. Okay. Good. Silence. Not an uncomfortable silence. Not the kind I grew up in. The kind that was really just the accumulation of things going unsaid. A different kind. A pause. She said, You were always. And then she stopped. I waited. I am very good at waiting. I've had 38 years of practice. She didn't finish. Not the word I expected. Not the word she'd been reaching for automatically. The word that fits in that sentence like a stone that's been dropped in the same groove so many times it's carved a permanent channel. She'd started toward it. You could hear the track of it in her voice, the beginning of the familiar, the reflex. And then she'd stopped. I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. She said, very quietly, Okay, thank you, Dara. And then she hung up. Hector appeared in the doorway with 2 coffees. He has a quality that I have never fully explained and which I suspect is not entirely explainable, which is that he arrives with coffee at the exact moment that coffee is required. He has never explained this either. He handed me one and leaned in the doorframe, looking at me with the direct assessment he reserves for structural evaluations. She almost said it, I told him. Said what? She said, You were always. And then she stopped. He looked at me. She almost said something different. He said, Almost said what? I thought about it. I'm still thinking about it, honestly. What was in the pause? What was she reaching toward when she caught herself? Something she'd never said in 38 years. Something that had no groove worn into the stone. Something that required more from her than reflex. What was it? I don't know. I genuinely, honestly, don't know. Maybe. You were always more capable than I gave you credit for. Maybe. You were always there, even when I didn't notice. Maybe something smaller and stranger and more specifically her. Something that doesn't translate easily into a sentence because the things we almost say are usually the things that resist easy sentences. Or maybe she just got scared and hung up. She's human. Humans get scared. I said to Hector, I don't know. Something different. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He looked out the window at the spring afternoon in Indianapolis, at the city doing its Thursday thing. He said, "You going to be okay?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You sure?" I said, "No. But that's not the same thing as not okay." He gave me the look he gives me when I've said something he's going to let stand without further commentary, which is the Hector equivalent of agreement. We sat there with the coffee and the Thursday light, and the question that my mother had started and not finished hanging in the room between us. And here's what I want you to understand about where I landed, about where I am now, sitting in this office with 23 properties and one lease my mother doesn't fully understand she signed. I didn't do it for the reveal. I keep having to remind myself of that, because the reveal makes such a clean story. The difficult one, the overlooked one, the one who quietly built something real while the golden child polished his performance, and the baby drifted sweetly through. It makes such a clean story that it's tempting to let the story be the point. But I didn't buy the house for a reveal. I bought it because at 31 I looked at an address on a spreadsheet and felt something move in my chest that I didn't have a name for. And the thing I did with that feeling was protect the person who'd caused it. That's not the story I'm supposed to be able to tell about my mother. I'm supposed to be bitter, or done, or triumphant in some satisfying and uncomplicated way. The difficult one wins. Credits roll. But the difficult children, and I say this as one, as the original, the one given the designation so early it became a kind of first name. The difficult children are usually just children who stopped pretending, who couldn't make the world flat enough to fit the version their family needed. And stopping pretending isn't the same as stopping loving, even when loving is expensive, even when loving is unreturned in the specific currency you keep hoping for. My mother said you were always and stopped. And in the stop, in the unfinished sentence, in the pause where the word usually lives, there was something, a crack, a hesitation, the smallest possible acknowledgement that the groove might be worn wrong, that the stone has been dropped in the wrong place, that the channel it's carved might not be the truth. I'm not calling it an apology. It wasn't an apology. I'm not calling it a turning point, because life is rarely organized into turning points the way stories are. And I've been in this business long enough. The business of managing structures, of assessing damage, of knowing the difference between a crack that's cosmetic and one that's going to cost you. To know that a single phone call does not restructure 38 years of load-bearing walls. But it was something. Hector is on his second coffee. The light is doing the low-angle thing that makes everything look about to mean something. I have 23 properties, 14 tenants, and one very specific lease agreement that renews in August at the same rate it has been for 7 years. The rent is not going up. I'm the difficult one. It turns out I'm also the landlord. And somewhere on Maple Crest Court, my mother is in the kitchen of the house I own, holding a question she didn't finish asking, standing in the groove of a sentence she's said 1,000 times, looking at the place where the word used to fit, in a house where the pipes work and the roof doesn't leak and the rent has never once gone up, wondering, maybe, possibly, in the small private country of her own unnarrated interior, what word goes there now? I'm not waiting for her to find it, but I haven't stopped hoping she will. That's the complicated part. That's the part that doesn't resolve. That's the part I carry out of the office on a Thursday afternoon in spring, past Hector who gives me the nod, down Delaware Street where the city is being a city, into a life I built in the specific shape of I will not need anyone to hand me anything. And I hold it, this unresolved thing. This love that is also grief and also stubbornness and also the irrational, infuriating, deeply human decision to keep the porch light on for someone even after you've understood that they may never really see you standing in it. I hold it, and I drive home, the difficult one, going home.